Hi, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Sustainable Cannabis Coalition podcast, in which we talk all things sustainability with some of the most distinguished experts in the cannabis industry. I'm your host, Rodrigo Pereira, VP of Product Management at GrowIQ. Today, we have a great panel of guests bringing over 80 years of collective experience in fertigation technology and cultivation. Jeff Neff from Argus Controls, Al Zylstra from Dram Corporation, and Chad Salute from Maven Genetics will discuss fertigation technology, its impact on facility design and water use, and how fertigation plays a role in driving sustainable practices within an operation. It's a great panel. Make sure to listen. Welcome back, everyone, to the Sustainable Cannabis Coalition podcast. Today, we'll be talking about fertigation in the context of cannabis, the technology, the role it plays in cultivation, and sustainability of cultivation facilities. We're incredibly lucky to have guests that bring something like a combined 80 plus years experience in fertigation, water system design, and cultivation. So welcome, Jeff, Al, and Chad.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So maybe before we get going here, I'll ask each of you to give a little bit of background on what you do, on the company, and maybe some initial thoughts about the context of sustainability in fertigation. So, Jeff, we'll get started with you.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Jeff from Argus Controls. I'm the application technical lead at Argus Controls. My primary role at Argus is to provide training both to Argus employees as well as our channel partners. I've been with Argus for over 25 years, so I started off as a technician, and I worked at Argus doing both commissioning and configuration of our Argus systems. Fertigation or irrigation, in terms of the sustainability, it is becoming more and more of a issue with a lot of our customers and growers. Primarily, it's we're looking at water usage, fertilizer usage, as well as the other side of that is simply the how do we increase productivity in our environments? Because with increased productivity becomes then essentially you are actually getting more out of your environment, which has a sustainability impact as well.
Wonderful, Jeff. Thank you so much. Al, how about if you take it away?
Yeah, thank you very much, Rodrigo. This is Al Zylstra. I'm with Dram Corporation. I manage the water division for Dram. I've been in the horticulture industry for approximately just a little over 30 years, focused entirely on mechanical systems designs, everything from control systems and fertigation systems to heating systems and water management systems. Our primary focus now is on water management, water treatment, fertigation, and integration of fertigation systems into commercial growing environments. It's been interesting with the cannabis industry. The cannabis industry's come in with a different perspective, and I think that I've learned over the past several years to respect that there is a different value in the cannabis crop. And so it does require somewhat of a different approach. At the same time, I've also observed a fairly substantial amount of non-sustainable practices, and I've found that most of those are born out of not being familiar with some tried and true methods that are in commercial horticulture. And so learning how to apply those and helping growers apply those in the cannabis situation, whether it's an indoor grow or an outdoor grow or a greenhouse grow, it all applies. And the primary area where I see that need is in fertigation.
That's Al. Thank you for that introduction, and I think you put out a couple of really fascinating nuggets there. So we'll definitely want to come back to those. Chad, you're up.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. My name is Chad Salute. I'm the director of cultivation for Maven Genetics in Los Angeles and Fish Alley. I manage 3 indoor cannabis cultivation facilities out here. Coming from a background of growing cannabis, probably about 20 years, wasn't my primary job, but 2 years professionally, 2.5 years professionally growing cannabis. really trying to take in as much as I can from the experts of like Jeff and Al, and trying to move cannabis forward into that professional standpoint. We have a lot to learn. I think Jeff and Al will touch on a lot of it. My primary job here is to create efficiency and to keep the quality up. So it's a troubleshooting job every day for me. And I reach out to the guys like that you have on, like Al and Jeff, to gain knowledge from them and to push our industry forward.
Thank you, Chad. And again, I think just having the perspective of someone that's doing the growing day in and day out is just incredibly valuable to any of this conversation, whether it's fertigation or any of the other systems that go into growing cannabis. Al, I think as a lead into our conversation, I want to go into probably touch on a couple of the points you mentioned, which is you're seeing a number of challenges out there in terms of operations using non-sustainable practices that kind of deviate from tried and true methods. So I'd love for you to kind of expand on that to kick off the conversation.
That's an interesting subject, and it's a pretty detailed subject as well, Rodrigo. I think really about the origins of cannabis production. We refer to a basement operation, and now it's above ground. And I believe that's the origin of a lot of the unsustainable practices, or practices that end up being unsustainable over time. And that is, if a grower has been accustomed to growing in let's say 1,000 square foot area, and growing a number of plants, the tendency has been over the years to simply multiply that. So if I have, if I was accustomed to growing 100 plants and now I'm growing 1,000 plants, I just do the same thing over 10 times this time. 1,000 plants to 10,000 plants. I just do 10 rooms that are 1,000 feet in size, and that results in a lot of inefficiencies and inefficiencies in terms of fertigation, irrigation in general, and climate management and crop management as well. An example of that might be a batch tank system, where the cannabis crop on a home grow or a small grow operation before maybe needed to be watered once a day, and that was the best way to do that was to make up a batch of fertigation water with the correct nutrient balance in it, and then water your plants with that. And so now we expand that today, and we have 10 or 20 rooms, and we see 10 or 20 batch tanks out there, and that gets to be particularly difficult to manage, and leads to some unsustainable practices, wasted water, wasted fertilizer, spills, and so on.
So, Al, I think that's a great point in terms of talking about scale. So, Jeff, I'd love to have you follow up on that in terms of, I guess from your perspective, from the technology implementation point of view, what are some of those challenges that you're seeing out there?
Well, hand mixing, batch tanks, really from to be able to deliver what you want for your plants. That's probably the most accurate way of doing it. So you can literally lay everything out, you measure out your fertilizers, you mix it, you get your pH right on target. And when it comes to a more of an automated system, an inline system that can deliver, thousands of plants with somewhat more efficiency, you got to look at, okay, if our pH point is, 0.1 or 0.2 off for a moment, how will that impact our crop truly? Right. In terms of the nutrient composition or the concentration, how will that impact the crop? So what happens is again, back to that basic way of hand mixing, which is really great for research or very small grow. When you scale it up, we got to have we have to define our tolerances. We need to do more research and say, okay, what can we do with this cannabis plant in terms of the pH? Because a lot of research has been done on other crops, but not a lot's been done on cannabis that I'm aware of, because it was never legal to do it on. So it still isn't in many ways. Right. So once we define those better, then those that information can then be fed to say, ourselves, where okay, now you can just put this target in and you have a little bit of leeway. I work with growers that say, oh, as long as that pH is within that little range, we're good. But I have had other growers that they've asked for like 64 different pH set point, and it's like, and they want to deliver that to the plant in the same pipe. So there's all sorts of mechanical challenges around doing that sort of thing, or it can be very expensive to do it. So just to lead to what Al was saying is starting from that method of feeding through, and very accurate, but very labor consumptive, as well as is the potential of waste on that level. And then we get to the more automated point where we got to know our limits.
Yes.
And Chad, I'd love you to chime in there.
Absolutely. I think growing up, or being in this field, back in the gray market days, we could waste quite a bit and still make money. And now that we're in a big warehouse in the legal market, our overhead and our bottom line is real tight. So, I found that these constraints that we used to put on ourselves is staying in a really tight pH range of like 5.8 or something like that. No, we can go 5.6 to 6.2. We could be within a more tolerable range and delivering nutrients. It doesn't have to be so precise. With still having a level of precise there that automation gives us. A lot of these pre-held conceptions of misconceptions of what cannabis needs is kind of, in my experience, going down the tubes. And Al and Jeff, it took using these big fertigation systems to really realize that, and implementing them. We're not getting a big difference of letting some of those constraints go with checking our leachate and monitoring runoffs and monitoring plants. A lot of attention's giving to that more than being sitting on a batch tank. Oh, it raised up a couple pH points. Well, now we know that a couple pH points is not going to matter in the long run, as long as we are checking our other controls that we have available, like our leachate or like our delivery systems and the redundancy factors that we have in place with these automated systems.
So I think, Jeff and Chad, you bring up a really interesting point in terms of, in a sense, the need to quantify some of these things within the industry to demystify, I think, some of the, like you said, some of the tribal knowledge that might have been coming out of basement grows, but that if you try to do at scale, just doesn't really apply, or like you said, Chad, you debunk it in a way.
Right. I believe that debunking the misconceptions from growing in these, as Al put it, these basement grows, a lot of them are going by the wayside. Cannabis, it is a very high dollar crop, and we want the best out of it. But a lot of the practices we used to use aren't the ways to get the best out of it. Environmental control, delivery of the water, dry back. These are the new kind of things we're looking at hard to get the best out of our plants, as long as we can keep our nutrient delivery system within our range, and everything else is more important at this point.
So that's fascinating, and I think going back to what you said in the intro, Chad, in terms of efficiencies, I think that's how you get to driving efficiencies. So just changing topics a little bit, and Jeff, maybe you can give to our listeners that might be not as familiar with fertigation technology, some of the differences between inline and batch fertigation, and well, why would a grower use one versus the other?
So a batch system, and there's two ways of describing a batch. Batch would be you're essentially making a batch. So you have a tank, you're adding your fertilizers in, you're measuring the EC, your pH, and you're essentially making a specific volume of final solution you're going to give to your plants. So in a inline injection system, or the nutrient systems that Argus, you have Argus or an Anderson injector, essentially you have fresh water coming into the system. All the nutrients and the pH correction is done as it's flowing through the system, at the end of that system, it comes out the final solution to give to the plant. So essentially, fresh water going in, final solution leaving, and goes to the plant. So then with that system now, you can adjust your pH, your EC, your different types of nutrients you want to put into that system as you go through it. So batch system, everything is pretty much mixed, pre-mixed, and then fed. Another form of batch system would be a dilute tank system, where it would be automated of bringing those solutions up to an EC or adjust the pH levels. And then it's water. So that would be another form of automated batch system, which is also done. But with the inline system, you have the ability to adjust your EC pH targets on the fly. And then you can pretty much give any part of your facility, depending how it's plumbed or piped in, a specific recipe.
So, and Alec, I guess I want to turn it over to you in terms of, having your experience in designing and constructing and implementing these systems. Why would a grower go with one system versus the other? And I guess kind of get your, how you go about that process.
Well, it's an interesting question. How you go about, or when would a grower decide to do one system versus the other? The dilute tank system, the batch tank system that Jeff refers to. The benefit of that we realized a long time ago, and that is I can make that very accurate. Make it once, and it doesn't matter whether I take the water out of that with a teaspoon or with a bucket. I'm going to get the same mix, and my plant is going to get the same mix. So you take that now and begin to expand that or multiply that by the number of zones, the number of irrigation zones that you have in a facility, the number of separate rooms, the number of separate crop stages. So you'll have a room that's got early vegetative stage plants, and another room that's got mid vegetative stage, another room that's going from vegetative into flower phase, and then flower finish. And each of those could require, and often do want to require, a different feed. And so the decision comes down to what's the complexity of the system that I need to have in order to satisfy that. And this is where having a knowledge of what's already been done in the horticulture industry for years in terms of inline injection really becomes helpful, as opposed to simply looking at the way it's been done in the basement for many years, the batch tank or dilute tank system. So I look at it, and one of the first things that I look at is how many rooms does a grower have? How many does a facility have? Is it a small 3 or 4 or 5 room facility, or is it a large 10, 15, 20 or more rooms in that facility? That's then also to the more rooms there are in a facility, the more inline injection becomes a more appropriate way to go. I was in a facility last week that had probably 200 batch tanks in a facility. Wow. A fairly large facility, but they had about 200 batch tanks. And there was somebody that spent the entire day, every day, refilling batch tanks, remaking mixes. And out of every batch tank that was made, there was some of that was lost, that was dumped down the drain. That's a nutrient waste. That's an unsustainable practice. It's a waste of water, all of those things. And so in a situation like that, inline injection makes a lot more sense, doing that on the fly. So when irrigation room number 1 calls for irrigation, it gets a feed. When irrigation room number 10 asks for water, it gets a different feed. And so what it comes down to is understanding the technology that's available to the grower rather than making assumptions. And so when in the cannabis industry, we've found that it's necessary to help the grower identify the value of the crop versus the simplicity of the systems. The value of the crop drives a lot of things in cannabis. We're dealing with a plant that's worth maybe $1,500, $2,000, and we tend to baby that plant. and well, we should. But then we also tend to think it needs to be really complicated. It's not uncommon to hear somebody a grower ask for 10 or 8 or 10 or even more uh, nutrient stock solutions and a half a dozen different recipes. While the simplicity of a typical commercial horticulture operation that also grows dozens and dozens of different varieties and species and stages of plants have learned to simplify things, and they'll have one or two feeds for an entire facility. Even a very large facility of 20 or 30 or 40 acres, you'll see one or two feeds in there. Now, that simplicity, and maybe that much simplicity, isn't quite appropriate for a plant as valuable as a cannabis plant, but there's a balance between. And so it's probably not 8 or 9 or 6 recipes. It's maybe 2 or 3 or 4 recipes that we're going to make available to those crops and have, instead of one irrigation line that has to switch each time the feed changes, the recipe changes, maybe we put 3 or 4 pipes into each room and allow that room or that valve to select which feed it wants.
Al, I think you touched on just a wealth of stuff there, and Chad, I'd love to kind of turn it over to you because you are in the grow every day, and I think this comparison between the value of the crop, but then how given the complexity and given everything that's going on in a grow operation, how simple these systems have to be in order for them to be efficient.
Right. So we do both, or I do both, manage a facility that does batch tanks and does inline fertigation. And my preference is inline. We do get some redundancy by mixing the batch tanks. Like we'll have the fertigation machine make the batch tanks, and we're able to check it on the batch tanks, so it gets delivered. We know exactly what's getting delivered. But we found that the fertigation systems work so well that it's not necessarily needed. We get around some of the challenges that Al put out there and this is probably not the most sustainable action, is to, if we have a feed in the same room and it's delivering from the same pipe, to use purge valves between the tables. So if there is that case that we have one in late bloom versus early bloom, and we do have 2 different recipes for that will purge it out a few minutes, or how long we know that will get out that nutrient in that pipe to deliver the new nutrients in there. What we have found is if there is a little bit of mixture there, it's not as noticeable as one may think. As long as we're delivering the majority of that recipe to that plant, if there's a little mixture in there, it's by the wayside, not as important. So touching on that subject, the keep it simple thing is I think is important to know that if you get a little mixture of early versus late, it's not going to make a big difference. One other thing that we do to facilitate our nutrients is growing a bunch of cultivars that have similar growth traits or similar nutritional needs growing in the facility. If it doesn't make the cut, and it's not sustainable to grow, we have to move away from it. I know we're craft cannabis, but at some point, this is a money-driven business, and we have to, we have to make sure that it makes sense in our facility. So the price demanding on certain crops, certain strains versus others, is not as significant as you would think, and some of the strains that didn't produce or were high dollar in the gray market are quite honestly not getting grown in the indoor market anymore. Maybe in the outdoor, but not in the indoor market anymore.
So I think as I think about this, again, seeing it from Chad, your perspective, Al, you're kind of integrating these systems and creating the design. Jeff, it kind of brings me back to you in terms of, I think there's a lot of complexity in terms of the system, but it has to be done simply for it to be effective in the context of the operation? Because how do you guys at Argus use that information, and how do you implement that to design systems that ultimately need kind of balance that simplicity between, or that the contrast between needing kind of advanced controls but also simplicity for the end user to
So that's
implement?
I mean, with these systems, how they're delivered, it's usually from the perspective, what are the requirements on site? And that is a discussion we have back and forth with the managers, the owners of these facilities, because sometimes they come to the table and I want to be able to do this, and this and that. And I've heard this conversation happen before, and they'll go, why aren't all the people that you guys work with ask for all these bells and whistles? And I don't say anything. I just say quiet, because I know 10 others that ask the same thing. And Al can probably nod.
We were one of them. We were one of them. I will say we asked for 16 injectors. Do I use 16 injectors? No.
Well, there you go.
Did we try? Yes.
You split into two systems, and now you have two more straightforward systems. So I think it yes, we try to simplify it, but our goal is to meet the requirements of the system. That is our first goal. The second is, how do we make it simple? And we will work with, in terms of simplifying the nutrient recipes, we provide training. I think that's also a thing that happens as you take over an automated system, is the level of training, the knowledge that you need to do for growing and using these systems. So the more complex facility you have, then that determines who you have to manage that equipment and that operation. So it's so that it can be a very if a system is delivered and they want all the bells and whistles, oftentimes you feel that stress level on the other end, because these people they're still learning how to use it. There's that huge lift. The systems that are designed in a simple fashion, it's usually not as much of a stress on the new users or growers. So I think what usually happens, it usually settles in to more of a basic approach to their system. That usually happens after the first weeks, months, possibly even a year after the place has been commissioned. But that's usually driven on site. And maybe Chad, you can comment about that, how that process of getting from a more complex to a more simple system in terms of your fertigation recipes and your irrigation scheduling.
Yeah, touching on that, Jeff, we were one of those facilities, and we wanted our old recipes and put in a bunch of additives that, we're in a big warehouse now, indoor grow facility, throwing through seaweed extracts and everything through our lines, and not realizing that the fallout or the biofilm or cleaning the lines. And yes, we moved away from quite a bit of our misconceptions of what the cannabis plant needs. I think the marketers in the cannabis industry have told us over the years that we need certain products for our plants to thrive. And just plain old research, reaching out to guys like yourselves, and realizing, no, with R&D in the shop, with having a more robust R&D of going through what's needed, what changes does this nutrient do, or what changes does this fertigation strategy do. That has driven our focus on more that aspect as environmental controls. We now have a very simple nutrient regimen that as long as we keep all other areas tight, we see the product being better than it ever has been before, as far as nutrient lockouts or plant diseases and everything else that can be mustered up to something as far as a nutrient lockout. We do more testing. We that has driven that testing forward, sending in plant tissue analysis, reaching out to plant pathologists. In the gray market, that was hard to get by. I mean, we'd have to go to a plant pathologist, and we'll send them something. Sometimes they'll test it, but it's cannabis. It was hard to do. So a lot of these things we were chasing down the wrong street on fixing our issues. But yeah, we have simplified our nutrient regimen down from 16 to probably about 5. And a couple of those we don't even deliver through our fertigation system. We deliver through a dosatron-free rack. So, it definitely has been a learning experience along the way. And speaking for myself, I'm learning every day from Big Ag. And I know moving forward, our margins are even going to be less and less. And we're trying to catch up, as far as where everybody else is in the Big Ag industry and efficiency versus the cannabis industry, because I know it's not sustainable for us to practice what we did before. We have to adapt and make a change as far as being way more efficient and bringing our bottom line down.
Chad, so I kind of want to follow that thread in terms of, I think the word efficiency has come up now a number of times. Al, I want to turn over to you in terms of, from your perspective, and again, in the context of sustainability, that sustainability kind of is driven by increases in efficiency. From your perspective, I think, what are some of the keys to improve efficiency in irrigation / fertigation?
That's a significant subject. One of the things I always start with is grow drier. And this is particularly true in the cannabis industry, but cannabis isn't the only guilty party. I go into vegetable operations, into cut flower operations, into bedding plant operations, ornamentals, and that's probably one of the largest problems the industry faces is overwatering, growing too wet. And so, the first rule is, first of all, reduce the use and grow drier. That's a real key, and be more precise about that. And that really leads to emphasizes the need for automation, to utilize something like the Argus control system, to be more precise about the irrigation. There's only so fast that a single person can run around and open irrigation valves and make decisions about irrigation and still do all of the other work that they're able to do. And turning it over to automation is the best way to deal with that. And the automation is, it's not just activating an irrigation valve, but it's also in the decision making. And it's very important to automate the decision making. Again, from a cannabis standpoint, in the basement, where a grower can lift the pot or look at each of one of 100 plants or 1,000 plants, it's just not practical to do that when you've got 10 or 20 or 30 or more thousand plants in there. But you can predict the growth of that, and that's where programs like accumulated light, vapor pressure deficit, based on growth phase, crop weight, based on EC or soil tensiometers, providing feedback on how much moisture is in the pot. Those become really important as the operation expands, and as you don't have the staff and the time to go around and pay particular attention to each particular plant. But you have to deal with it on a gross level. Some things that we often overlook are things like the uniformity of the growing medium or the substrate that we use, whether that's cocoa fiber or peat moss or a combination of other things, or rock wool. Rock wool is pretty easy because it comes usually prepackaged, so the density is standard. But again, I've stood by and watched pots being filled and pots being filled by 3 or 4 different people. Each one puts a slightly different amount of substrate into a pot. Each one of them compacts it at a different rate. And so when you go to water, each pot absorbs water differently. And because the density and the compaction of the growing medium is different. So you might water 10 plants exactly the same, or 100 plants exactly the same, but if they have 100 different soil densities in them, they're going to hold that water differently. And so you're going to see a substantial difference in the growth of that. So something like that doesn't seem to be related at all to irrigation is important. reducing hand watering if it's and if it's unavoidable, to train people on how to hand water. 1001, 1002, 1003, move. 1001, 1002, 1003, move. I watched somebody irrigate. I watched 3 different people irrigating again about a week ago. And one I could count to 10 Mississippi, and the other one I could count to 2 Mississippi. All of those plants were being watered differently, but there is a way to do, even if you have to hand water, to train that so that people can do that. But better yet, reduce the hand watering and to do it automated. Let the computer is going to be much more accurate at measuring the environment and timing and looking at when the crop is going to need to be watered, and also is much more accurate than a human being at doing it precisely. If you need to have an irrigation shot that's 2 minutes and 30 seconds long, it can do that. Whereas a person is not going to usually be very consistent on that, or maybe 2.5 minutes their cell phone rings. Those are some examples.
That's and Al, thank you for sharing that. I think this kind of brings me to the last question of the podcast, which Al and you touched on it in terms of the importance of automation and having some of these, let's say, more autonomously driven systems controlling the systems within the grow to remove human error. So I'd love to ask the 3 of you, as you kind of peer into the future, what are either some methods or technologies that you could see helping improve sustainability in cannabis facilities? And Jeff, we'll start with you.
Back to deploying technologies that's already been established in the horticultural industry, like plant monitoring, weight, moisture content, leach monitoring. This is all, proven technology that can easily be deployed in facilities. In terms of what in an Argus system, you already have the ability to monitor flow. We can alarm. So really utilize what you already have. That would be, that's the next. Actually, that should be the number one thing. Utilize what you already have. Understand what sort of sensors you can use to alarm off, and then you can move to adding more equipment. And the other part is going to be the next sort of phase would be, how do we track your data? How do we gather all these bits and pieces from the VPD, temperature, humidity, plant weight, volume, all that, and how do we track that for your, and compare that to your production record? So then we get a bit of a clearer picture of how these inputs are impacting your production.
Kind of picking up where Jeff just left off. Understanding your unit cost. What does it cost to produce a gram of finished product? At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter what we put into the plant, what our inputs are, if it doesn't make a difference in the yield that we're gaining from that crop. And so, measuring that data, capturing that data, what is your yield, and how does that relate to the conditions in the growing facility? How does you got a certain number of grams per square meter on this particular crop? What were the temperatures? What were the humidity profiles during that period of time? What was the nutrient program in there? And I think that's where the industry is in still what I think is the nascent stages of marrying technology that's been available from other growers in the horticulture industry for decades and decades and decades, and marrying that to the cannabis plant and the cannabis growing to learn that. And I've seen a huge improvement inside of a decade, inside of a half a dozen years in the knowledge that's out there. But I also continue to see a significant gap in that. And one of those examples is I still see a lot of growers in the cannabis industry that don't really understand the nutrient profile that they're using. They're very accustomed to utilizing a standard pre-mixed grade of fertilizer, and not really understanding what is the NPK and the micronutrients the macros and the micros in that nutrient profile. They just know that it's so many ppm that they're growing at. And that's one of the things that becomes really important going down into the future is understanding the chemistry of your water and understanding the nutrients that the plant is going to use, looking at the leachate that's recovered from that plant to see what it's used versus what you put in, and in learning how to do that and automating that process so that it's done repeatedly. If you have a successful crop, what was the data behind that successful crop? And what was the science and the chemistry of the water behind that crop? And now I know that, I can repeat that again. That becomes a very significant piece of the puzzle.
Al, that's I think all of those are just incredibly insightful, and wholeheartedly agree. So, Chad, I'd love to close.
Yeah,
with,
what Al said was huge.
Yep.
I mean that those are the things, understanding these nutrients is something that myself I need help with. I do reach out to agronomists. I do send out our leachate. We do all this testing to actually glean insight from our analytics that we all take down, and that what Argus gives us on our environments and everything else. So that is something that has driven us to become more efficient and to take out certain nutrients we thought we might need, or certain additives or biostimulants that we thought really were the silver bullet and are making our cultivars the best they can be. So I know this has been in other industries for quite some time, but it is something that cannabis growers are learning, or at least I'm learning. I would hope that there's other people that claim to be master growers that say they already know the answers to. But it is lots of testing, lots of analytics, realizing what created that plant to thrive the best it can, and doing it again consistently. I know Al touched on the growing media and how much water we water, and those are all things we look for. Having a really consistent, uniform crop, consistent media, and it all matters in the end product so much. But moving forward, I would like more sensors. I know we put a bunch of flow meter on. We have moisture content for our plants, and using those as far as being able to deliver efficiency has been huge for us.
Well, gentlemen, I'd probably stay here and talk to you for the next hour, but I want to be mindful of your time. Thank you so much for the conversation, for all the insights that you've brought into the conversation. It's been fascinating. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Rodrigo.
Thanks, Rodrigo.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, everyone, again, for joining the Sustainable Cannabis Coalition podcast. Today we had Jeff Neff from Argus Controls, Chad Salute from Maven Genetics, and Al Seistra from DRAM. Thank you all for joining. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Sustainable Cannabis Coalition podcast. If you like what you heard, tune into our next episode, and make sure to check out our content on our website at sustainablecannabiscoalition.com, and make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Yep, we're pretty much everywhere. Till next time.